The university at night is a labyrinth of shadows, echoing with more than just the hum of the HVAC. As a janitor, I've learned a few things that aren't in the employee handbook. Secrets whispered in the dark corners. Rules that keep the spectral residents at bay. What happens if you acknowledge those faint voices from the deserted lecture hall? Let's just say you'll be clocking out with more than just dirt. The clock in Blackwood Hall struck midnight, each chime reverberating through the empty corridors like a death knell. I stood in the main hallway of Crestfall University, my cleaning cart squeaking slightly as I shifted my weight from one foot to the other. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with that particular frequency that seems to drill directly into your skull after hours of exposure. My name is Danny Reeves, and 3 weeks ago I thought landing this night janitor position was a stroke of luck. The pay was unusually generous for custodial work, the hours suited my lifestyle, and the application process had been surprisingly brief. No extensive background checks, no multiple interviews, just a handshake with the facilities manager and a start date. I should have known something was wrong from the beginning. My first night, I'd arrived at 10 p.m. sharp, just as the last of the evening classes were wrapping up. Students streamed past me like water around a stone, their faces buried in phones, their conversations about exams and parties and weekend plans. Normal. Entirely, beautifully normal. By 10:30, the building had emptied completely. The transformation was immediate and unsettling. The hallways that had been filled with life just moments before became hollow shells, stretching endlessly in both directions. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. The shadows grew longer, darker, more substantial. I'd been standing near the main entrance, reviewing my task list on the clipboard, when I heard footsteps approaching from behind. I turned to find an elderly man shuffling toward me, his maintenance uniform worn and faded, his face deeply lined with age and something else, something that looked like permanent exhaustion mixed with a healthy dose of fear. "You're the new night guy," he said. It wasn't a question. His voice was rough, like gravel being crushed underfoot. "That's right, Danny Reeves. Nice to meet you, mister." I extended my hand. He stared at my hand for a long moment before taking it. His grip was surprisingly strong, his skin cold and papery. "Theodore Walsh. Everyone calls me Theo. I've been doing nights here for 37 years. He paused, his watery eyes blue, searching my face. "You seem like a decent kid. Smart?" "I'd like to think so," I replied, uncertain where this conversation was heading. Theo nodded slowly, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of yellow legal paper. The creases were worn, soft from repeated folding and unfolding. He pressed it into my palm, his fingers lingering for a moment longer than necessary. "This isn't official. You won't find any of this in your employee handbook or your training materials. But if you want to make it past your first month, if you want to leave here every morning in one piece, you'll memorize every word on that paper." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "And Danny, whatever you do, don't think you're special. Don't think you're brave enough or smart enough to test these rules. Men better than you and me have tried. Their families are still waiting for them to come home." Before I could respond, before I could ask any of the 1,000 questions suddenly flooding my mind, Theo turned and shuffled away, disappearing around a corner. I never saw him again. When I asked the day shift supervisor about him the next afternoon, she looked at me with confusion. "Theodore Walsh? He retired 6 months ago, moved to Florida to be with his daughter. Why do you ask?" I'd mumbled something about mistaken identity and changed the subject, but my hands had been shaking. That night, back in my apartment before my second shift, I'd unfolded the yellow paper and read the rules written in cramped, hurried handwriting. Rules for night custodial staff, Crestfall University. Rule 1. In the chemistry lab, room 347, West Wing, there is a broken beaker on the third shelf of the supply cabinet. It has been broken for longer than you've been alive. Do not clean it. Do not touch it. Do not acknowledge its existence. The stains around it are not chemical residue. Rule 2. The restricted section of the Milton Library, 4th floor, East Wing, must always have exactly one light on. Not 2, not 0, 1. Use the green shaded desk lamp on the center table. If you find it off, turn it on immediately and leave without looking at the books. Rule 3. The old lecture hall, basement level, south building, will sometimes contain voices, whispers, conversations, laughter. You will never see anyone inside. Do not respond. Do not investigate. Do not acknowledge that you hear anything. Walk past quickly and quietly. If a voice calls your name, walk faster. Rule 4. The elevator to the clock tower is operational, but should never be used after midnight. If you hear it moving on its own, be somewhere else. Rule 5. If you encounter another custodian you don't recognize and they ask you to help them with a spill or a mess, decline politely and leave the area immediately. We work alone on night shift. We have always worked alone. Rule 6. The mirrors in the third floor bathroom of the administration building sometimes show reflections that don't match reality. If you see someone standing behind you who isn't there when you turn around, finish your task calmly and exit. Do not run. They chase. Between 2:47 a.m. and 3:03 a.m., stay in well-lit, open areas. Do not be in stairwells, storage rooms, or anywhere without multiple exits. This is non-negotiable. The list went on. 15 rules in total, each more bizarre and unsettling than the last. I'd laughed at first, assuming it was some kind of hazing ritual for new employees. But sitting there in my apartment, remembering the absolute terror in Theo's eyes, the desperate sincerity in his voice, I couldn't quite convince myself it was a joke. My second night at Crestfall University, I'd kept the paper in my pocket, my fingers occasionally brushing against it like a talisman. I'd followed the rules without really believing them, telling myself I was just being cautious, just avoiding any potential weirdness until I got more comfortable with the job. And nothing happened. I cleaned classrooms and offices, emptied trash cans, mopped floors. It was boring, monotonous work, exactly what I'd signed up for. The third night was different. I was mopping the hallway on the second floor of the West Wing, my mind wandering, when I noticed the temperature drop. Not gradually, but all at once, like someone had opened a freezer door. My breath misted in front of my face. The lights flickered just once, but enough to make my heart rate spike. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Measured, steady footsteps coming from the floor above me. I froze, mop in hand, water dripping onto the floor I'd just cleaned. According to the schedule, I was supposed to be the only person in this building. The security guard wouldn't make his rounds through here for another 2 hours. The footsteps stopped directly above my head. For several long seconds, there was absolute silence. Then, slowly, deliberately, something began to drag across the floor. It sounded heavy, irregular, like furniture being moved, or a body being pulled. I remembered Rule 4. I remembered Theo's words. I remembered that I had rent to pay and student loans to worry about, and I couldn't afford to quit a job that paid this well. So I gripped my mop tighter, finished the section of floor I was working on, and moved methodically to the next area, forcing myself not to look up at the ceiling, not to acknowledge what I was hearing. After 10 minutes that felt like 10 hours, the sounds stopped. That was 3 weeks ago. Since then, I've experienced things I can't explain and don't want to think about too carefully. I've learned to trust the rules, even when they don't make sense, especially when they don't make sense. Tonight, standing in that hallway listening to the midnight chimes fade away, I pulled out my task list. Chemistry Lab 347 was on the schedule for a basic cleaning. My stomach twisted into knots. I'd been avoiding that room, taking care of every other space in the West Wing first, but I couldn't put it off any longer. The hallway leading to the chemistry lab seemed longer than it should be. The fluorescent lights here were older, the bulbs casting a sickly yellow glow that made everything look jaundiced and wrong. My footsteps echoed oddly, sometimes sounding like there were 2 sets of feet instead of 1. I reached the door to room 347. The frosted glass window was dark inside. I pulled out my key ring, hands trembling slightly, and unlocked the door. The smell hit me first. Chemistry labs have a distinctive odor, that mix of cleaning supplies and various chemical compounds. But this was different. Underneath the expected smells was something else. Something organic and rotten, like flowers left too long in standing water. I flipped the light switch. The overhead fluorescence sputtered to life, revealing rows of black-topped lab tables, sinks with their faucets gleaming dully, and shelves lined with equipment and supplies. Everything looked normal, clean, professional. Everything except the supply cabinet against the far wall. I could see it from where I stood in the doorway. The third shelf, just as Theo's note had specified. Even from this distance, I could make out the broken beaker. It was a large one, maybe 1,000 milliliters, and it had been shattered violently. The glass shards remained exactly where they'd fallen, frozen in time, surrounded by dark stains that had seeped into the wooden shelf. Those stains were too dark for any chemical I knew, too organic. I forced myself to breathe steadily and began my cleaning routine. Sweep the floors, check the sinks for debris, wipe down the lab tables, empty the small trash cans stationed throughout the room. All basic tasks. All things that kept me far away from that cabinet. But I couldn't stop stealing glances at it. The broken beaker seemed to draw my attention like a magnet, pulling at the corners of my vision even when I deliberately looked away. As I worked, I became increasingly aware of a presence in the room. Not a person, nothing so tangible, but a weight in the air, a sense of being watched. The temperature in the lab was dropping again. I was wiping down the last table when I heard it. A soft sound, barely perceptible. The gentle clink of glass against glass. I froze, my hand still pressed against the black tabletop. The sound came again, louder this time. It was coming from the supply cabinet. The broken beaker's shards were moving. I could see them from across the room, shifting and sliding against each other, rearranging themselves in patterns that defied physics. The dark stains around them seemed to pulse, growing darker, wetter, as if the wood was bleeding. My training kicked in. Every instinct screamed at me to investigate, to understand what I was seeing, to apply logic and reason to the impossible. But Theo's rules were clear. Do not acknowledge its existence. I packed up my cleaning supplies with deliberate calm, forcing my movements to remain smooth and unhurried. I didn't run. I didn't even walk quickly. I simply finished what I could safely finish and prepared to leave. As I reached the door, I made the mistake of glancing back one final time. The supply cabinet was open. I knew it had been closed when I entered. I was certain of it. And standing in front of it, barely visible in the harsh fluorescent light, was a shadow. Not a shadow cast by anything in the room, but a shadow that existed independently. A darkness shaped roughly like a human figure. It was staring at the broken beaker. And as I watched, unable to look away despite every warning screaming in my mind, it reached out a hand toward the glass shards. I left. I pulled the door closed behind me, locked it, and walked away. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it might crack my ribs. Behind me, from inside the sealed lab, I heard the unmistakable sound of glass shattering again, followed by something wet hitting the floor. I didn't look back. I couldn't, because I knew with absolute certainty that if I did, I would see something that would make it impossible for me to ever enter that building again. And despite everything, despite the terror and the wrongness of this place, I needed this job. The rest of the night stretched ahead of me, full of shadows and whispers and rules I didn't understand but had to follow. The chemistry lab was just the beginning. The library was waiting. And after that, the lecture hall. The lecture hall with its voices. The lecture hall where something knew my name. Dawn felt impossibly far away. The encounter in room 347 left me shaken in ways I couldn't fully articulate. I found myself in the custodial closet on the second floor, sitting on an overturned bucket, hands trembling as I tried to process what I'd witnessed. The shadow figure, the moving glass, the impossible opening of a cabinet I knew had been closed. Every rational part of my brain scrambled for explanations, fatigue, stress, tricks of the light, but I'd seen what I'd seen. More importantly, I'd felt it. That presence in the room, thick and suffocating, like the air before a lightning strike. I checked my watch. 12:47 a.m. The night had barely begun. After several minutes of deep breathing and a generous gulp from my water bottle, I forced myself back to my feet. The task list still had a dozen items unchecked. The chemistry lab was done, or at least as done as it was going to get. I'd fulfilled my basic duties there without breaking the first rule, and that would have to be enough. But my mind kept circling back to that broken beaker, to Theo's cryptic warning. The stains around it are not chemical residue. What did that mean? What had happened in that lab that left behind a relic so dangerous that decades of janitors had been worn away from it? I thought back to my first day, before I'd met Theo, when I'd reviewed the building schematics and floor plans in the facilities office. Crestfall University had been founded in 1847, its original buildings constructed with that Gothic New England architecture that looked beautiful in daylight and deeply unsettling after dark. The West Wing, where the chemistry lab was located, had been added in 1923. Nearly 100 years of students, professors, experiments, and accidents. The day shift supervisor, Patricia Morano, had mentioned during my orientation that the university had an impressive safety record. We've only had 3 serious incidents in the entire history of the school, she'd said proudly, and none in the last 40 years. At the time, I'd nodded along, impressed by the statistic. Now I wondered what qualified as a serious incident and what had been quietly swept under the rug, relegated to whispered warnings on yellow legal paper. I gathered my supplies and headed toward the faculty offices on the 3rd floor. These were easier assignments, less prone to supernatural interference. Just empty trash cans, dust surfaces, vacuum carpets. Mindless work that let me process the earlier encounter. The offices were arranged in a long corridor, doors on either side bearing nameplates of professors in various departments. Dr. Helena Voss, Comparative Literature; Dr. James Thornton, Medieval History; Dr. Rashid Kumar, Theoretical Physics. I worked my way down the hall methodically, unlocking each office with my master key, completing my tasks and moving to the next. It was in Dr. Kumar's office that I found the newspaper clipping. I wasn't snooping, not really. I was emptying his wastebasket when a yellowed piece of newsprint fluttered to the floor. The paper was old, brittle, dated September 15th, 1957. The headline read, "Student Disappearance at Crestfall University Remains Mystery." Below it was a photograph of a young man, probably 19 or 20, with dark hair and an earnest smile. His name was given as Leonard Ashby, a chemistry major in his junior year. The article was brief. Leonard had been working late in the chemistry lab on September 12th, conducting an independent research project under the supervision of Professor Emil Cartwright. According to witnesses, Leonard had been alone in the lab after 11 p.m. The next morning, the lab was found in disarray. Beakers shattered, chemical spills across multiple surfaces, and scorch marks on one of the lab tables. But Leonard Ashby himself had vanished without a trace. The article concluded with a statement from the university administration expressing concern and a plea for anyone with information to contact the campus security office. There was no follow-up article in the wastebasket, no resolution to the story. My hands were shaking again as I held the clipping. September 12th, 1957, room 347, the chemistry lab. The same lab where a broken beaker sat on the third shelf, surrounded by stains that weren't chemical residue. The same lab where shadows moved independently and glass rearranged itself. I carefully folded the clipping and slipped it into my pocket alongside Theo's rules. I needed to know more, but first, I had to finish my shift. I had to survive the night. The rest of the third floor passed without incident, and by 1:30 a.m., I was ready to move to my next major location, the Milton Library. The library was housed in its own building, connected to the main academic complex by an enclosed walkway. As I pushed my cleaning cart across the elevated passage, I could see the campus spread out below me. Street lamps cast pools of amber light across empty pathways. The bare branches of oak trees clawed at the October sky. In the distance, the clock tower loomed, its face dimly illuminated, hands pointing to 1:34. I thought about Rule 4. The elevator to the clock tower is operational, but should never be used after midnight. If you hear it moving on its own, be somewhere else. I hadn't been near the tower yet during my shifts, and I planned to keep it that way. The library doors were heavy oak, carved with elaborate scrollwork. My key turned smoothly in the lock, and I pushed inside. The main floor of the Milton Library was a cathedral to knowledge. High ceilings supported by marble columns, rows of wooden tables and chairs, stacks stretching back into shadows. The circulation desk sat empty, its computer monitors dark. The silence was absolute, the kind of quiet that presses against your eardrums. I consulted my task list. The main floor needed basic maintenance, but my primary focus was the restricted section on the 4th floor. I took the stairs rather than the elevator, my footsteps echoing off the marble. Each floor I passed was darker than the one before, the automatic lights having shut off hours ago. The 4th floor was pitch black when I arrived. I fumbled for the light switch, found it, and flipped it up. Nothing happened. I tried again. Still nothing. A cold sweat broke across my back. I pulled out my flashlight, clicking it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. The restricted section was at the far end of the floor, separated from the main stacks by a wrought iron gate. The gate was unlocked. It always was, according to my instructions, and I pushed it open with a creak that sounded obscenely loud in the silence. My flashlight beam swept across rows of old books, their leather spines cracked with age. The smell here was distinct: old paper, dust, and something else. Something that reminded me of the chemistry lab, that underlying scent of organic decay. The restricted section housed the university's oldest volumes, including several rare manuscripts and first editions. It also housed, according to Theo's rules, something that required a very specific light source. I found the center table easily. It was a massive thing, solid oak, probably weighing several 100 pounds. On it sat a green-shaded desk lamp, the kind you'd find in a 1920s banker's office. I set down my flashlight and examined the lamp. The cord ran to an outlet on the floor. The switch was in the off position. Rule 2 was clear. The restricted section must always have exactly one light on. Use the green-shaded desk lamp on the center table. If you find it off, turn it on immediately and leave without looking at the books. I reached for the switch, my fingers brushing the cool metal. As I did, I heard something. A soft sound, barely perceptible. The whisper of pages turning. I froze, my hand on the lamp switch, and slowly turned my head toward the sound. 20 feet away, in the beam of my flashlight lying on the table, a book was opening. Not falling open, not blown by wind. There was no wind in this sealed room, but deliberately opening, pages flipping one after another, as if invisible hands were searching for something specific. Turn it on immediately and leave without looking at the books. I flipped the switch. The green-shaded lamp came to life with a soft click, casting a pool of emerald light across the table's surface. The moment the light touched the surrounding darkness, the sound of turning pages stopped. Complete silence returned. But in that silence, I could feel them. Presences, multiple presences, arranged in the shadows beyond the lamp's glow, watching, waiting. I grabbed my flashlight and backed towards the gate, moving slowly, keeping my eyes forward. Don't run, they chase. That was from Rule 6 about the mirrors, but I had a feeling that applied here too. Whatever inhabited this restricted section, whatever required that single light to remain on, I didn't want to trigger its pursuit. As I reached the wrought iron gate, I heard a voice. Not a whisper this time, but a clear, articulate voice speaking in what sounded like Latin. The words were formal, rhythmic, almost ceremonial. I didn't understand them, but I felt their weight, their significance. This was not random haunting. This was something organized, purposeful. I pulled the gate closed behind me and walked quickly to the stairs, my heart pounding. Only when I descended to the 3rd floor did I allow myself to stop and breathe. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the flashlight steady. I checked my watch. 2:15 a.m. I had half an hour before the dangerous window specified in Rule 7. Between 2:47 a.m. and 3:03 a.m., stay in well-lit, open areas. 16 minutes. Theo had been specific about those times, right down to the minute. What happened during that quarter hour? What emerged or awakened or hunted during that specific window? I decided to use the remaining time to clean the library's main floor, staying in the open, keeping multiple exits visible at all times. I worked faster than usual, efficiency taking precedence over thoroughness. By 2:40, I was done. I positioned myself at one of the reading tables near the center of the main floor, all the overhead lights blazing, doors visible in 3 directions. At 2:47 exactly, the temperature dropped. Not the gradual cooling I'd experienced before, but an immediate, savage plunge. My breath turned to fog. The lights flickered but held steady. And then I heard them. Footsteps. Dozens of footsteps, coming from every direction at once. Up the stairs, down the stairs, across the floors above and below. Footsteps in the walls. Footsteps where no feet could physically be. I sat perfectly still at that table, hands gripped together, watching the clock on the wall. 2:48. 2:49. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I could hear breathing now, ragged and wet, as if dozens of people were running marathons just out of sight. The lights flickered more insistently. Shadows moved at the edges of my vision, darting between bookcases, sliding across floors. 2:52. Something walked past me, so close I felt the displacement of air. I didn't turn my head. I didn't acknowledge it. I kept my eyes on that clock, counting the seconds. A voice spoke directly into my ear. "Why are you here?" it asked. The voice was wrong. Too many tones layered over each other, like a choir speaking in unison but slightly out of sync. I didn't answer. I didn't move. Sweat ran down my back despite the freezing temperature. 2:56. The footsteps were all around me now, circling the table. I could see them in my peripheral vision, shapes that were almost human but not quite. Proportions subtly wrong, movements too fluid or too jerky. 2:59. 3 more minutes. Something touched my shoulder. Fingers, icy cold, pressing through my uniform shirt. "Answer me," the multi-toned voice insisted. "Why are you here?" My jaw clenched so tight I thought my teeth might crack. 2 more minutes. The fingers tightened, nails digging in. Pain blossomed across my shoulder. The lights went out, plunging the library into absolute darkness. I could hear things moving in that darkness, shuffling and scraping and breathing. So much breathing. 2:02. 1 more minute. "Answer me!" The voice screamed directly into my face, close enough that I felt the impossible cold of its breath. 3:03. The footsteps stopped. The breathing ceased. The fingers released my shoulder. The lights flickered back to life, steady and normal. The temperature began to rise, slowly returning to the ambient cool of a climate-controlled building. I was alone in the library. Completely, utterly alone. I stood on shaking legs and examined my shoulder. Through the fabric of my shirt, I could see 4 distinct marks, punctures where nails had pressed deep enough to break skin. They were already bruising, dark purple spreading across my skin. This was no hallucination, no stress-induced fantasy. Something had touched me. Something had demanded answers, and only Theo's rules had kept me safe. I gathered my supplies with numb hands and left the library. I still had hours left on my shift, but I needed a moment to compose myself. I needed to think. The newspaper clipping in my pocket felt heavy, significant. Leonard Ashby had disappeared from the chemistry lab in 1957. What if he hadn't been the only one? What if Crestfall University had a darker history than Patricia Moreno's 3 serious incidents suggested? As I crossed back over the walkway towards the main academic building, I looked down on the campus below. In the distance, near the south building where the old lecture hall is located, I saw a light, a single window, glowing faintly in the basement level. That was impossible. I knew that building was supposed to be empty. I knew the lecture hall down there was abandoned, used only for storage. And yet, the light was there, steady and inviting. The old lecture hall, Rule 3, the whispers, the voices that called your name. I had 3 more hours until dawn, 3 more hours to survive. And despite every instinct screaming at me to avoid that basement, I knew I would have to pass it by eventually. The south building was on my rotation. I had cleaning assignments there. The question wasn't whether I would encounter whatever haunted that lecture hall. The question was whether I could walk past it without answering when it called my name. Because somehow, I already knew it would. They always did. The break room in the basement of the administration building became my sanctuary during that endless night. I sat at the scarred Formica table, a cup of bitter vending machine coffee cooling between my hands, and tried to make sense of what was happening to me. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, their steady buzz a reminder that some things in this building still functioned according to normal physical laws. Some things, but not all. My shoulder throbbed where those invisible fingers had gripped me. I'd locked myself in the bathroom and checked the wounds under the harsh lights. 4 crescent-shaped punctures, deep enough to draw blood, arranged in a pattern that perfectly matched human nail punctures. Except no human had touched me. I'd been alone at that table. Alone with something that existed in the spaces between reality and nightmare. I pulled out the newspaper clipping about Leonard Ashby and read it again, searching for details I might have missed. The article was frustratingly vague, offering more questions than answers. What had Leonard been researching? What experiments required working alone in a chemistry lab after 11 p.m.? And most importantly, what had Professor Emil Cartwright known about his student's disappearance? On impulse, I pulled out my phone and searched for Professor Cartwright. The university's historical archives section, and after several minutes of digging, I found him. Professor Emil Cartwright, Department of Chemistry, 1948 to 1962. There was a brief biography noting his work in organic synthesis and his sudden retirement in 1962 due to health concerns. No photograph, no further details. But 1962 was only 5 years after Leonard's disappearance. Was that coincidence? I searched for Leonard Ashby next, hoping for more information about the missing student. What I found made my blood run cold. There were others. Not many, and spread across decades, but they were there. Jennifer Hartley vanished 1973, last seen in the Milton Library. David Cross disappeared 1989, last known location, the South Building. Rebecca Tao, missing since 2001, final sighting near the clock tower. 4 disappearances across nearly 50 years, all students, all last seen on campus late at night. The cases had gone cold, been classified as runaways or voluntary disappearances. But I knew better now. I'd seen what lurked in these buildings after dark. I'd felt the cold fingers on my shoulder. These students hadn't run away. They'd broken the rules, and they'd paid the price. My coffee had gone cold. I checked my watch, 3:47 a.m. I'd been hiding in this break room for nearly 45 minutes, putting off the inevitable. My task list still had several items unchecked, and the South Building was waiting. But first, I needed to understand more about the library, about that green-shaded lamp and what it was protecting, or protecting against. I pulled up the university's archives on my phone again, this time searching for information about the Milton Library. The building had been completed in 1889, funded by a donation from Augustus Milton. His only daughter, Constance Milton, had been a voracious reader with dreams of becoming a scholar, but she died of tuberculosis at age 19, never fulfilling that ambition. The library had been built in her memory. The restricted section had been added in 1923, the same year the West Wing chemistry lab was built. That couldn't be coincidence. I dug deeper, following links and cross-references until I found a small notation in a digitized board meeting record from March 1923. Discussion of materials acquired from the Whitmore estate. Motion to create secure storage for sensitive documents. Motion passed. The Whitmore estate. I searched for that name and found only fragments. The Whitmore family had been prominent in Maine during the colonial period, involved in shipping and trade. There were vague references to eccentric practices and unfortunate incidents, but nothing concrete. Whatever materials Crestfall University had acquired from them in 1923 had been deemed sensitive enough to require a locked restricted section. And now those materials, those books, needed a light kept on all the time, not for preservation, not for security cameras, for something else entirely. Something that preferred a subtle illumination, as Theo's rules had stated. I thought about what I'd heard in that restricted section, the turning pages, the Latin incantation, the multiple presences watching from the shadows. Whatever Constance Milton's memorial library had become, it was no longer just a repository of knowledge. It was a prison, or a temple, or both. My phone buzzed with a low battery warning. I silenced it and stood, my legs stiff from sitting too long. It was time to face the rest of my shift. Time to continue the job that was either going to make me rich or drive me insane. Possibly both. I made my way back through the administration building, past the third-floor bathrooms with their problematic mirrors, Rule 6, do not run, they chase, and toward the connecting corridor that would take me to the south building. The hallway was longer than it should be, the perspective stretching in ways that defied architecture. My footsteps echoed strangely, sometimes delayed, sometimes doubled. The south building was the oldest structure on campus, part of the original 1847 construction. It had been renovated multiple times over the decades, but traces of its history remained visible in the exposed beams, the thick stone walls, the narrow staircases that twisted at odd angles. During the day, it housed several administrative offices and storage rooms. At night, it belonged to something else. I entered through the main doors, my master key turning smoothly in the ancient lock. The interior was dark, my flashlight beam cutting through shadows that seemed thicker here, more resistant to illumination. The air smelled of old wood and dust, and that now familiar scent of decay. My task list directed me to the second-floor storage rooms first. I climbed the stairs carefully, testing each step before putting my full weight on it. The building settled around me, wood creaking, pipes groaning, normal sounds, mundane sounds. I clung to that normalcy like a lifeline. I was on my third storage room when I heard it. Music. Faint and distant, but unmistakable. It was coming from below, from the basement level. The melody was old-fashioned, something from the 1940s or 50s, played on what sounded like a phonograph. The sound quality was scratchy, wavering, as if the record was warped or the player was malfunctioning. I froze, my hand gripping the handle of my mop. According to my task list, I wasn't scheduled to clean the basement tonight. That was tomorrow's rotation. But the music continued, growing slightly louder, and with it came voices. Not the whispers Theo had warned about, but actual conversation, laughter, the sound of chairs scraping across a floor. Rule 3 was specific. The old lecture hall will sometimes contain voices, whispers, conversations, laughter. You will never see anyone inside. Do not respond. Do not investigate. Do not acknowledge that you hear anything. But I wasn't in the lecture hall. I was 2 floors above it. The rule said to walk past quickly and quietly, but I wasn't walking past it at all. I was avoiding it entirely. So technically, I wasn't breaking any rules by hearing this music, these voices. Even as I rationalized, I knew I was playing a dangerous game. The rules existed for a reason. Theo had survived 37 years by following them exactly. But curiosity gnawed at me, that same morbid fascination that makes people slow down to look at car accidents. I finished the storage room I was working on and moved to the next, but the music followed me. It was louder now, accompanied by more voices. I could almost make out words, almost distinguish individual speakers. A woman laughing, a man saying something that prompted more laughter, the clink of glasses, a celebration of some kind. By the time I completed the second floor tasks, it was 4:23 a.m. Dawn would come around 6:15, and I still had the first floor offices to clean. But the music from the basement had become impossible to ignore. It wasn't just background noise anymore. It was insistent, demanding, like someone had turned up the volume specifically to get my attention. I stood at the top of the basement stairs, shining my flashlight down into the darkness below. The stairs descended steeply, disappearing around a corner. The music was definitely coming from down there. So were the voices. And now I could hear something else. Footsteps, the rhythm of dancing, people moving in time to that scratchy, ancient melody. Every rational part of my brain screamed at me to leave, to finish the first floor offices and get out of this building, to stick to the rules that had kept me alive so far. But I'd seen the newspaper articles. I read about the disappearances, and I needed to understand what was happening in this place. I needed to know what I was really dealing with. I descended the stairs slowly, one hand on the wall for balance, the other holding my flashlight. The temperature dropped with each step, my breath misting in beam of light. The music grew clearer. I recognized the song now, In the Mood by Glenn Miller, a big band standard from the 1940s. The basement hallway was narrow and low-ceilinged, forcing me to hunch slightly. Doors lined both sides, most of them locked, leading to storage spaces in mechanical rooms. At the end of the hall, a set of double doors stood partially open. Light spilled through the gap, warm, golden light, completely at odds with the cold fluorescent bulbs throughout the rest of the building. The old lecture hall. I approached slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs. The music was loud now, accompanied by laughter and conversation and the sounds of a party in full swing. Through the gap in the doors, I could see movement, shadows dancing across walls, the flicker of candlelight or lantern light. I reached the doors and peered through the opening. The lecture hall was enormous, far larger than should have been possible given the building's dimensions. Rows of wooden seats descended towards a stage at the front. The walls were paneled in dark wood, hung with portraits of stern-faced men in outdated clothing. And filling those seats, standing in clusters, dancing in the aisles, were people. Dozens of them. Men in military uniforms from various eras. Women in dresses ranging from Victorian gowns to 1960s shifts. Students in clothing spanning decades. They talked and laughed and danced, drinks in hand, celebrating something I couldn't identify. But something was wrong with them. Their movements were slightly off, too smooth or too jerky. Their faces, when I could see them clearly, were vacant, eyes staring straight ahead, mouths moving but not quite matching the sounds they produced. And they were translucent, not quite ghosts, not quite solid, something in between. On the stage, a band played, or at least, instruments played themselves. A saxophone moved through its fingerings with no one holding it. Drums beat without visible sticks. A piano's keys depressed in complex patterns while the bench sat empty. I should have left. I should have backed away quietly and fled the building, but I was transfixed, unable to tear my eyes away from the impossible scene before me. That's when one of them turned and looked directly at me. It was a young woman in a 1950s-style dress, her hair perfectly curled, her lips painted bright red. She smiled, but the expression didn't reach her vacant eyes. She raised a hand and waved at me, beckoning. "Danny," she called out, her voice cutting through the music. "Danny Reeves, come join us. The party's just getting started." My blood turned to ice. She knew my name. They knew my name. More heads turned toward the door, more vacant eyes fixed on me, more smiles that didn't quite reach the right muscles, more hands beckoning. "Danny," they said in unison. "Come in, Danny. Stay with us, Danny. It's so lonely here without you." If a voice calls your name, walk faster. I stumbled backward, breaking eye contact, turning away from those terrible smiling faces. The voices rose behind me, calling my name over and over, each repetition more desperate, more demanding. "Danny! Come back, Danny! We have so much to show you!" I ran. I didn't care about Rule 6 anymore, didn't care about chasing or consequences. I sprinted down that basement hallway, taking the stairs 3 at a time, my flashlight beam swinging wildly. Behind me, the music cut off abruptly, replaced with other sounds, the scraping of chairs being pushed back, footsteps, many footsteps, moving in unison, pursuing. I burst through the door to the first floor and kept running, through the south building's main hall, out into the cold October night. I didn't stop until I was halfway across the quad, gasping for breath, my legs burning from exertion. When I finally looked back, the south building stood dark and silent. No lights in the windows, no music, no voices. Just an old building, shadows and stone, innocent in its stillness. But I knew what I'd seen. I knew what had called my name. I checked my watch with shaking hands. 4:51 a.m. Less than 90 minutes until dawn. I still had tasks uncompleted, areas uncleaned. But I couldn't go back into that building. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. I pulled out my phone and called the facility's emergency line, preparing a lie about a potential gas leak or a burst pipe, something that would justify abandoning my post. But before the call connected, I remembered the newspaper articles, the disappearances. 4 students gone, their cases cold, their families still waiting for answers that would never come. What if I ran? What if I quit this job, left Crestfall University behind, tried to forget everything I'd witnessed? How long would it take before another janitor was hired, before someone else, someone without Theo's rules, walked into these buildings unprepared? How long before the 5th disappearance? I ended the call before it could connect. I couldn't leave. Not yet. Not until I understood what was happening here and whether there was any way to stop it. Theo had survived 37 years by following the rules, but Theo had also fled, retired abruptly, moved to Florida, left this nightmare behind. Except he'd come back one last time, in my first night, to hand off those rules, to give me a fighting chance. Why me? Why had Theo sought me out specifically? Had he seen something in me that made him think I could handle this? Or was I just the latest in a long line of night janitors, each receiving the same warning, each making the same choice to stay or flee? I took a deep breath of cold night air and made my decision. I would finish my shift. I would follow the rules, and I would dig deeper into Crestfall University's history, searching for answers about what haunted these halls and why. But first, I had to go back to the Milton Library, because somewhere in my panicked flight from the South Building, I'd realized something crucial. The green-shaded lamp in the restricted section wasn't just keeping something at bay, it was marking something, claiming territory, asserting control over a space that wanted to belong to the darkness. And if I was going to survive this job, if I was going to help others survive, I needed to understand the logic behind the rules, not just follow them blindly, but comprehend the system, the hierarchy, the boundaries between the living world and whatever existed in these buildings after midnight. The library stood silent as I approached, its marble columns ghostly in the pre-dawn darkness. I let myself in with my master key and climbed the stairs to the 4th floor. The green-shaded lamp still glowed in the restricted section, its emerald light a small, defiant beacon against the surrounding shadows. I stood at the wrought iron gate, studying that pool of light, and made myself a promise. I would learn the truth about Crestfall University, about Leonard Ashby and Jennifer Hartley and David Cross and Rebecca Tao, about Professor Cartwright and the Whitmore estate and whatever had been locked away in 1923. And I would make sure no one else disappeared. The lamp flickered once, as if in acknowledgement, that burned steady. Behind me, somewhere in the depths of the library, I heard the soft sound of pages turning. Dawn was coming, but the night was far from over. I made it through the rest of that shift on autopilot, my body going through the motions while my mind raced with implications and theories. By the time dawn broke over Crestfall University, painting the Gothic architecture in shades of gold and amber, I was standing in the parking lot beside my car, every muscle in my body aching with exhaustion. The puncture wounds on my shoulder had stopped bleeding, but throbbed with a deep, persistent pain that radiated down my arm. I drove home in silence, too drained even for music. My apartment felt surreal in its normalcy. Dishes in the sink, yesterday's mail on the counter, my cat Whiskers meowing irritably about her delayed breakfast. I fed her, showered away the night's sweat and terror, and collapsed into bed. But sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those translucent figures in the lecture hall, their vacant stares and too wide smiles. I heard them calling my name in perfect unison. By noon, I gave up on sleep and sat at my laptop, coffee cup in hand, determined to dig deeper into the university's history. The disappearances were documented, but sparse. I needed more context, more connections. I started with the Whitmore estate, the source of those sensitive materials that had required the restricted section's creation in 1923. The Whitmore family had indeed been prominent in colonial Maine, but their wealth came with whispers of darker dealings. I found a digitized historical journal from 1876 that mentioned Jeremiah Whitmore's peculiar library and his obsession with forbidden knowledge. Another source, a memoir by a former servant, described strange gatherings at the Whitmore mansion, midnight ceremonies, chanting in unknown languages, visitors who arrived after dawn and left before dawn. Jeremiah Whitmore had died in 1891 under mysterious circumstances. His body had been found in his library, surrounded by open books, his face frozen in an expression of absolute terror. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but the servant's memoir hinted at something else. She'd written, "The books consumed him. He thought he was the master, but he was only ever the servant." The Whitmore estate had sat empty for decades after Jeremiah's death, his children wanting nothing to do with the property. Finally, in 1922, it was sold to pay debts. The contents were auctioned, and Crestfall University had purchased Jeremiah's entire library for an undisclosed sum. Those books now sat in the restricted section, watched over by a green-shaded lamp that could never be turned off. I leaned back in my chair, rubbing my tired eyes. The pattern was becoming clearer. Jeremiah Whitmore had collected something dangerous, texts that were more than just words on pages, books that had agency, that could influence reality. And when Crestfall University acquired them, the hauntings had begun in earnest. The chemistry lab incident with Leonard Ashby in 1957, the other disappearances, all occurring after 1923. But what about the lecture hall? That felt different from the library's scholarly horror or the chemistry lab's scientific nightmare. The lecture hall was a celebration, a party frozen in time, filled with people from different eras, all gathered for some incomprehensible purpose. I searched for information about the South Building's history and found something interesting. Before it became an academic building, the original structure was a meeting hall for the town of Crestfall. It had hosted everything from town meetings to wedding receptions to memorial services. Memorial services. I sat up straighter, my exhaustion momentarily forgotten. What if the lecture hall wasn't just haunted? What if it was a collection point, a gathering place for those who had died on campus or were connected to Crestfall in some way? That would explain the different eras of clothing, the mix of students and soldiers and civilians. I thought about the young woman who called my name, her 1950s dress, her perfect curls. On impulse, I searched the university archives for photos from that era. I scrolled through yearbooks, candid shots of campus life, formal portraits. And then I found her. Her name was Catherine Hendricks, class of 1953. She'd been a music major, active in the drama club, engaged to be married to a local boy named Thomas Wright. According to a brief obituary I found in the local newspaper archives, Catherine had died in December 1952, just months before her planned graduation. The cause of death was listed as accidental drowning in the campus fountain, but the obituary included a strange detail. Catherine's body had been found by the night watchman during his rounds. She'd been fully dressed, as if she'd been walking across campus, when she'd somehow fallen into the shallow fountain and drowned. The water had been less than 2 feet deep. I pulled up more obituaries, cross-referencing names with the university records. David Cross, the student who disappeared in 1989, had officially been classified as missing, but I found a memorial service announcement from 1990. His family had held a service declaring him legally dead, accepting that he was never coming home. Jennifer Hartley, vanished in 1973, had a similar memorial service in 1975. They were all there, in the lecture hall. Not just the ones who had disappeared, but everyone connected to Crestfall University who had died under mysterious or tragic circumstances. The lecture hall had become their eternal reunion, their endless party, their prison disguised as a celebration. And they wanted more guests. My phone alarm buzzed, startling me out of my research spiral. 8 p.m., 2 hours until my shift started. I'd spent the entire day digging through archives and had barely scratched the surface, but I had enough now to understand the scope of what I was dealing with. Crestfall University wasn't just haunted, it was a nexus, a thin place where the boundary between the living and the dead had worn dangerously transparent. I ate a quick meal, fed Whiskers again, and tried to psych myself up for another night. My shoulder still ached, and the thought of returning to those buildings made my stomach churn with anxiety. But I'd made my choice. I was seeing this through. At 9:45 p.m., I pulled into the employee parking lot. The campus was transitioning from evening classes to night mode. Students streamed out of the buildings, their voices carrying across the quad, normal and alive, and blissfully unaware of what prowled these halls after they left. I envied them their ignorance. I checked in at the facilities office, grabbed my equipment, and reviewed my task list. Tonight's rotation included areas I'd managed to avoid or minimize during previous shifts: the basement of the administration building, the clock tower access corridor, and, inevitably, a more thorough cleaning of the south building, including the first floor that I'd abandoned in my panic the night before. Patricia Moreno was working late, finishing up some paperwork in her office. She looked up as I passed and gave me a tired smile. "Danny, right? How are you settling into the night shift?" "Fine," I lied, returning her smile. "Still getting used to the quiet, but it's not bad." Good. Listen, I wanted to mention, we've had a couple of reports of lights being left on in the library's restricted section. I know it's not your fault, probably just a faulty switch, but could you make sure to turn it off when you finish up there? Budget's tight and every little bit helps. My blood went cold. The green desk lamp? That's the one. It's been on every morning when the day staff arrives. Just flip it off before you leave, okay? I nodded mutely, not trusting my voice. Rule 2 was explicit. The lamp had to stay on, always. But now I was being directly ordered by my supervisor to turn it off. This was a test, or a trap, or the universe's way of asking just how committed I was to following Theo's rules. "Sure thing," I managed to say. "I'll take care of it." Patricia smiled and returned to her paperwork, oblivious to the death sentence she'd just handed me. I started my shift with the basement of the administration building, working quickly through storage rooms and mechanical spaces. The building felt heavier tonight, the air thicker, as if it were holding its breath. I kept checking my watch compulsively, tracking the time until the dangerous window between 2:47 and 3:03 a.m. At 11:30, I moved to the clock tower access corridor. I'd been avoiding this area, but it was on tonight's required list. The corridor was a narrow hallway leading to the elevator that serviced the clock tower. According to the building plans, the tower itself housed the clock mechanism and an observation deck that hadn't been open to the public since the 1970s. The elevator doors were old brass, ornately decorated with Art Deco patterns. A small call button sat between them. I wasn't planning to use the elevator, Rule 4 was clear about that, but I needed to clean the corridor and the small waiting area. As I mopped the floor, I became aware of a sound. A mechanical whirring, the groan of cables and pulleys. The elevator was moving. I froze, watching the floor indicator above the doors. It was an old-fashioned dial with a needle that pointed to numbers. The needle was moving downward. 5th floor, 4th floor, 3rd floor. Be somewhere else. I grabbed my equipment and backed away from the elevator, retreating down the hallway. The mechanical sounds grew louder. Second floor, first floor, ground floor. The elevator doors opened. The interior was empty, completely, utterly empty. But the temperature in the corridor dropped 30 degrees in an instant. My breath came out in clouds of vapor, and from inside that empty elevator car, I heard breathing. Slow, labored breathing, like someone who'd been running for miles. The breathing moved. Out of the elevator, into the corridor, coming toward me. I couldn't see anything, but I could track its progress by the way frost formed on the walls in its wake, spreading in patterns like frozen ferns. I turned and ran, abandoning my cleaning cart, fleeing down the hallway toward the main building. Behind me, the breathing grew faster, more excited, as if my flight had triggered a pursuit instinct. Footsteps pounded after me, heavy, irregular footsteps that suggested something not quite human. I burst through the connecting door and slammed it shut behind me, my hands fumbling with the lock. The footsteps reached the door. Something heavy crashed against it from the other side, once, twice, 3 times. The door shuddered in its frame, but held. Then, silence. The breathing stopped. The pounding ceased. After a full minute, I risked a glance through the door's small window. The corridor was empty. My abandoned cleaning cart sitting exactly where I had left it. The elevator doors were closed. Everything looked normal. But frost still covered the walls in intricate patterns, slowly melting in the warmer air. I leaned against the wall, trying to slow my racing heart. That made twice I'd broken the rules, or come dangerously close to breaking them. First by investigating the lecture hall, now by being near the elevator after midnight. The rules weren't suggestions. They were survival instructions. Hard-won knowledge paid for in blood and disappearances. I retrieved my cart eventually, moving quickly, not looking at the elevator. The rest of the shift passed in a blur of routine tasks. I avoided the library entirely, unable to face the decision about that lamp. If I left it on, Patricia would complain again. If I turned it off, I'd be violating Rule 2. And whatever those books were, whatever those presences in the shadows wanted, they'd be free to act. By 5 a.m., I had one location left, the South Building's first floor, the area I'd fled from the night before. I stood outside the building staring at its dark windows, gathering my courage. The party in the lecture hall was real. Catherine Hendricks and all the others were down there, waiting. They knew my name. They'd called to me. And if I went back inside, they'd call again. But I had to finish my shift. I had to prove to myself that I could face this horror and not break. I entered the building and made my way to the first floor offices. I cleaned methodically, focusing on the work, trying not to think about what waited in the basement below. The building was quiet. No music, no voices, just the normal creaks and groans of an old structure. I was finishing the last office when I heard it. A single voice, female, singing softly. The song was We'll Meet Again by Vera Lynn, a World War II standard. The voice was beautiful, clear and pure, filled with a melancholy that made my chest ache. It was coming from the basement. I knew I should leave. I'd completed my assigned tasks. I could clock out, go home, return tomorrow night. But that voice was so lonely, so heartbreaking, that I found myself walking towards the basement stairs almost against my will. The singing grew clearer as I descended. It was Catherine Hendricks, I was certain. The same voice that had called my name, but different now. Vulnerable. Human. The music and party sounds were gone. Just one girl singing alone in the dark. I reached the basement hallway and saw that the lecture hall doors were closed. Light leaked out from underneath, but it was dimmer than before, softer. I approached slowly and pushed one door open just enough to peer inside. The lecture hall was empty of the partygoers. The seats sat vacant, the stage bare. But on the stage, barely visible in the dim light, a single figure stood. Catherine Hendricks, still wearing her 1950s dress, still looking exactly as she had in her yearbook photo. She was crying. "Please," she said, her voice breaking. "Please help us. We didn't want this. We just want to go home." Every instinct I'd developed over the past weeks screamed at me not to respond. Rule 3 was absolute. Do not respond. Do not investigate. Do not acknowledge that you hear anything. But this wasn't whispers or laughter or a terrifying party. This was a young woman, dead for 70 years, trapped in a nightmare she didn't understand. I opened my mouth to speak, to offer comfort, to ask what she needed. And then I saw them. Behind Catherine, emerging from the shadows at the edges of the stage, were the others. Dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, all wearing the same vacant expressions from the night before. They weren't crying. They weren't sad. They were hungry. Catherine's tears stopped. Her expression shifted, melting from grief to something cold and predatory. "Thank you, Danny," she said, her voice losing its human warmth. "Thank you for acknowledging us." The figures began to move forward, shambling toward the edge of the stage, toward me. I slammed the door and ran. Again. For the third time in 2 nights, I fled through the south building, terror driving my legs faster than I'd known I could move. Behind me, I heard the lecture hall doors crash open, heard hundreds of footsteps pursuing me, heard my name being called by a chorus of dead voices. "Danny, come back, Danny! You spoke to us. You acknowledged us. You're ours now." I hit the exit doors at full speed, bursting out into the pre-dawn darkness. The footsteps behind me stopped at the threshold, as if some invisible barrier prevented them from leaving the building. I kept running anyway, across the quad, past the library, not stopping until I reached my car in the parking lot. I sat behind the wheel, hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. The south building stood silent in the distance, no light in its windows, no sign of the horror it contained. But I'd broken the rule. I'd acknowledged them. I'd almost spoken to Catherine, and that moment of weakness had nearly cost me everything. Dawn was breaking, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. I'd survived another night, barely. But I knew with absolute certainty that I couldn't keep doing this. Something had to change. Either I needed to find a way to end the hauntings, or I needed to run like Theo had run. The question was, which choice would let me live with myself? I drove home as the sun rose over Crestfall University, knowing that tonight, when I returned, I would have to make a decision about the lamp. About the rules, about whether I was the kind of person who could walk away from people, dead people, yes, but still people who were trapped and suffering. The horror of Crestfall University wasn't just the supernatural terror. It was the impossible moral weight of knowing the truth and having to choose between survival and compassion. And I had no idea which I would choose. I didn't sleep that day. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Catherine Hendricks transforming from grief-stricken girl to hungry predator. I heard the chorus of dead voices calling my name. I felt the weight of those hundreds of footsteps pursuing me through the South Building's corridors. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table, Theo's yellow paper spread out in front of me, and I studied the rules like they were sacred text. Because in a way, they were. Each rule represented someone's experience, someone's close call, someone's escape from something terrible, or maybe someone's failure to escape. How many janitors had there been before Theo? How many had learned these lessons the hard way? The sun tracked across my apartment windows as the day wore on. I called in sick to my day classes at the community college. A lie, but a necessary one. I needed to understand what I was dealing with. I needed a plan. By noon, I'd made a decision. I couldn't keep running. I couldn't keep barely surviving each shift, waiting for the moment when my luck ran out, or my reflexes slowed, or I made one fatal mistake. I needed to understand the system, the hierarchy, the rules behind the rules. I spent the afternoon researching everything I could find about death rituals, spiritual boundaries, and the folklore of New England hauntings. Most of it was useless. Tourist trap ghost stories and academic discussions that treated the supernatural as metaphor. But buried in a digitized collection of Maine folklore, I found something relevant. It was an account from 1847, the year Crestfall University was founded, written by a local minister named Reverend Joshua Blackwood. He described the land where the university now stood as a thin place, where the veil between worlds grows gossamer in the dark hours. He warned against building there, claiming that structures raised on such ground become vessels, and vessels must be filled. Vessels must be filled. The phrase echoed in my mind. What if that's what Crestfall University had become? A collection of vessels, buildings that attracted and contained spiritual energy, dead souls, echoes of trauma and death. The chemistry lab with its broken beaker and the stain that wasn't chemical residue, the library's restricted section with its hungry books, the lecture hall with its eternal party of the dead, even the elevator to the clock tower carrying something invisible up and down, searching for passengers. And the rules? They were the boundaries, the instructions for navigating these vessels without becoming part of their contents. But boundaries could be changed. Vessels could be emptied. If I understood the system well enough, maybe I could do more than just survive. Maybe I could help. That thought should have terrified me. Instead, it felt like purpose crystallizing from chaos. I arrived at Crestfall University at 9:30 p.m., half an hour early. The campus was in its transition period, students leaving, lights dimming, the living world retreating to make room for something else. I sat in my car and watched the clock tower, its illuminated face visible across the quad. The hands pointed to 9:37. I thought about Rule 7. Between 2:47 a.m. and 3:03 a.m., stay in well-lit, open areas. 16 minutes. Theo had been precise about those times, down to the minute. Why those specific times? What was significant about 2:47 and 3:03? On impulse, I pulled out my phone and searched for significant events on those times. Nothing obvious appeared. Then I tried a different approach. I searched for the numbers themselves, 247 and 303. What I found made my skin crawl. In some numerological traditions, 247 represented spiritual awakening and divine timing, and 303, it was associated with communication with the divine and the presence of ascended masters. Between 247 and 303, the veil wasn't just thin, it was nearly transparent. That's when they were strongest. All of them. The shadows in the chemistry lab, the presences in the library, the partygoers in the lecture hall, the thing in the elevator, carrying something invisible up and down, searching for passengers. I checked the time, 9:52 p.m. Time to start my shift. The facilities office was empty when I checked in, my time card stamped automatically by the machine. I gathered my equipment and consulted my task list. Tonight's rotation was comprehensive, every building, every floor, including, I noted with a sinking feeling, a specific instruction: ensure all unnecessary lights in Milton Library restricted section are off. PM. Patricia's order: turn off the lamp. I started with the West Wing, tackling the chemistry lab first. I wanted to face my fears in order, starting with the one that had haunted me since my first week. Room 347 was dark when I arrived, the hallway silent except for the hum of the HVAC system. I unlocked the door and flipped on the lights. The broken beaker sat on its shelf, exactly as it had always been. The dark stains around it looked fresh, wet, despite being decades old. I kept my eyes averted as much as possible while I cleaned, but I couldn't help stealing glances. Tonight, something was different. The glass shards were arranged in a pattern, not the random scatter of broken glass, but a deliberate configuration. They formed letters, words. Help us. My hands froze on the mop handle. The glass shifted slightly, shards sliding against each other with soft clinks, rearranging themselves. Trapped. I forced myself to breathe. This was communication, not an attack, not a threat, but a message. Whatever had happened to Leonard Ashby in 1957, whatever had created that broken beaker and those stains that weren't chemical residue, it wanted help. I don't know how, I whispered to the empty room, breaking my own rule about not acknowledging anything. I don't know what to do. The glass shards suddenly scattered, as if blown by a violent wind, though the air in the room was perfectly still. The temperature plummeted, and on the shelf where the beaker had been, frost began to form in patterns that looked almost like writing. I couldn't read it. The symbols were nothing I recognized, some kind of chemical formula or alchemical notation. Then, as quickly as it had begun, it stopped. The temperature normalized, the frost melted away. The glass shards lay scattered, random again, meaningless. But I'd seen it. I'd witnessed intentional communication from something that existed beyond death, beyond normal physical loss, and it had asked for help. I finished cleaning the chemistry lab in a daze and moved through the rest of the West Wing on autopilot. My mind raced with implications. If the entity in the chemistry lab could communicate, could the others? Were they all trapped, all seeking release, or were some of them predators, using the appearance of victimhood to lure in the living? I thought about Catherine Hendricks, her tears and her plea. Please help us. We didn't want this. We just want to go home. Had that been genuine? Or was it a trap, a lure designed to make me acknowledge her, to give her power over me? By 1:30 a.m., I'd reached the Milton Library. The building felt different tonight, more alert, more watchful. I climbed the stairs to the 4th floor, my flashlight cutting through darkness that seemed thicker than usual, more resistant to illumination. The green-shaded lamp glowed in the restricted section, its emerald light a small beacon. I stood at the wrought iron gate, staring at that lamp, trying to make my decision. Patricia had ordered me to turn it off. My supervisor, my boss, the person who controlled whether I kept this job. But Rule 2 was absolute. The lamp had to stay on. Always. What would happen if I turned it off? Would the books be freed? Or would whatever presence lurked in those shadows be unleashed? Or was the lamp's light actually a prison, keeping something confined that deserved to be free? I thought about Jeremiah Whitmore, consumed by his books. He thought he was the master, but he was only ever the servant. What if the lamp wasn't protection? What if it was a leash keeping dangerous knowledge contained, but also keeping it alive, fed by the fear and attention of those who followed the rules? I made my decision. I walked through the gate, approaching the center table. The green-shaded lamp seemed to glow brighter as I drew near, as if sensing my intent. Around me, I felt those presences gathering, watching, waiting. The air grew heavy with anticipation. I reached for the lamp switch. My hand trembled. And then I heard it. A voice, clear and distinct, speaking not from the shadows, but from directly behind me. Don't. I spun around. An elderly man stood there, wearing a faded maintenance uniform. His face was deeply lined, his eyes weary but sharp. Theodore Walsh. Theo. "You're supposed to be in Florida," I said stupidly. He shook his head. "I've never been to Florida, Danny. I've been here the whole time, watching, making sure the new night janitor followed the rules." "But," Patricia said. "Patricia tells people what they want to hear, what keeps them from asking too many questions." Theo moved closer, his movements stiff, as if he were in pain. "I warned you on your first night. I gave you the rules, but you've been testing them, haven't you? Investigating, trying to understand." "They asked for help. The thing in the chemistry lab, it spelled out messages with the glass. Help us. Trapped. What am I supposed to do with that?" "You're supposed to survive, Danny. That's all. That's the only job that matters. The dead are dead, Danny. They're beyond our help. The rules exist to keep the living alive." "But what if we could free them? What if there's a way to—" "There isn't." Theo's voice was sharp, cutting. "Do you think you're the first to have that thought? Do you think I didn't spend years trying to find a way to help them? I tried everything. Research, rituals, bringing in priests and mediums and paranormal investigators. Nothing worked. Nothing changed. All I did was put more people in danger." He gestured around the restricted section, at the shadows that pressed against the edge of the lamp's light. "These things, Danny, they're not just ghosts. They're parasites. They feed on attention, on acknowledgement, on the energy of the living. Every time you respond to them, every time you try to help, you make them stronger. The rules aren't cruel. They're mercy. Mercy for us and mercy for them." "What about Catherine Hendricks?" I demanded. "She died in 1952. She was 19 years old, engaged to be married. She's been trapped in that lecture hall for over 70 years, Danny. How is leaving her there mercy?" Theo's expression softened with something like pity. "Catherine Hendricks isn't trapped in the lecture hall, son. Catherine Hendricks is gone. She died in 1952, and whatever piece of her soul that moved on did so a long time ago. What's in the lecture hall is an echo, a recording, a psychic impression left in the fabric of this place. It has her face and her voice and fragments of her memories, but it's not her, not really. You don't know that, I said, but my voice lacked conviction. I do know that, because I've watched those echoes for 37 years. I've seen them repeat the same patterns, say the same words, play the same scenes. They don't grow or change or learn. They're stuck, yes, but not in the way you think. They're stuck the way a photograph is stuck, capturing one moment forever. He moved to the table and placed his hand on the lamp, his weathered fingers gentle on the green shade. This lamp doesn't imprison the books, Danny. It keeps them dormant. The knowledge in those volumes, Jeremiah Whitmore's collection, it's alive in a way that knowledge shouldn't be. It wants to be read, to be understood, to be used. And when it is, it consumes the reader. Leonard Ashby found one of these books. He smuggled it into the chemistry lab, thought he could control it, use its secrets for his research. Instead, it used him. The broken beaker was part of his attempt to close a doorway he'd opened. It didn't work. So he's the one asking for help? Leonard? No, Leonard is gone. What's asking for help is what came through the doorway. And it's lying. It wants you to free it, to give it more power, more reach. The rules keep it contained. I stood there, my hand still hovering near the lamp switch, feeling the weight of Theo's words. Everything I thought I understood about the hauntings was crumbling. They weren't trapped souls seeking peace. They were echoes and parasites and things that wore human faces but had forgotten how to be human. "Why did you give me the rules?" I asked quietly. "Why not just let me quit after the first week like most people probably do?" Theo sighed. "Because someone has to do this job, Danny. Someone has to maintain the boundaries, follow the rituals, keep the vessels from overflowing. I've done it for 37 years, but I'm old now, tired. I need to know there's someone who can take over, someone smart enough to learn the rules and strong enough to follow them. Even if it means leaving them in torment? They're not in torment, they just are, like the wind or the tide, natural forces that exist without suffering or joy." He paused, studying my face. "But if you can't accept that, if you're going to keep trying to save them, you'll just become another cautionary tale, another name added to the list of disappeared students." I looked at the lamp, its green light steady and unwavering. I thought about Patricia's order to turn it off. My supervisor told me to turn this off. What do I tell her? Tell her the switch is broken. Tell her you'll submit a maintenance request. I'll make sure it gets lost in the system like it has for the past 40 years. Theo smiled grimly. Patricia knows the truth on some level. She's been here long enough. She gives orders that seem reasonable, orders that a normal janitor would follow, but she doesn't push when those orders aren't followed. She's testing you, same as I did. The clock somewhere in the library chimed twice. 2 a.m. I had 47 minutes before the dangerous window. "I need to finish my shift," I said. Theo nodded. "I'll walk with you for a bit. Make sure you don't do anything stupid." We left the restricted section together, the green lamp still burning behind us. As we descended the stairs, I asked the question that had been nagging at me. Why those specific times, 2:47 to 3:03? The times when Reverend Blackwood performed his ritual in 1847. When the university was founded, he tried to consecrate the ground, to strengthen the veil instead of accepting its thinness. He failed. Instead, he created a pattern, a rhythm. Every night at those exact times, his failed ritual echoes through the buildings, and in that echo, the boundaries dissolve almost completely. We exited the library into the cold October night. The campus was utterly silent, every building dark except for scattered security lights. What about the South Building, the lecture hall? What do I do about that? You walk past it quickly and quietly. You don't acknowledge the voices. You don't investigate. You don't try to help. Theo's voice was firm. That's the hardest rule, I know, but it's the most important. Those echoes can sense sympathy, and they use it like a hook. Catherine called your name because she sensed you were someone who would care. Don't let that caring destroy you. We reached the South Building. I could see the basement windows from here, dark and still. No music tonight, no lights, just silence. I have to clean the first floor, I said. I know. I'll wait here. If you're not out in 20 minutes, I'm coming in after you. I nodded, grateful for his presence, and entered the building. The first floor was exactly as I'd left it the previous night, offices waiting to be finished, floors half mopped. I worked quickly, efficiently, keeping my eyes on my tasks and my mind focused on mundane details. The building was quiet, no singing, no whispers. But as I approached the hallway that led to the basement stairs, I heard it. A single voice, male this time, speaking conversationally. She really did care about you, you know, Catherine. She thought you might be different, someone brave enough to help us. I kept walking, pushing my cart toward the exit. We're not monsters, Danny. We're just stuck, and it's so lonely here, so cold. If you would just acknowledge us, just speak to us, we could... I was at the door now, my hand on the push bar. Danny! The voice exploded into a roar, losing all pretense of humanity. Danny Reeves, look at me, speak to me, acknowledge me. I pushed through the door and let it close behind me. Theo was there, waiting as promised. Inside the building, something crashed against the door repeatedly, accompanied by inhuman screeching. Then silence. Good, Theo said simply. You're learning. We walked across the quad together, an old janitor and a young one, separated by decades but connected by the same impossible burden. As we walked, Theo told me stories about the times he'd almost broken the rules, about the janitors before him who hadn't been so lucky, about the strange equilibrium that existed at Crestfall University, where the living and the dead maintained an uneasy coexistence. It won't always be this hard, he said as we reached the parking lot. You'll get used to it. The fear fades. The horror becomes routine. That's both good and bad. Good because you can function. Bad because you might get careless. How long did you really do this? I asked. 37 years. Started when I was 23, finished when I was 60. I had a life outside this place. Wife, kids, grandkids. They never knew what I really did here. They thought I was just a janitor. He smiled sadly. Maybe that's all I was. A janitor. Someone who cleaned up messes and maintained boundaries and kept things from getting worse. That's not nothing, I said. No, it's not nothing. And neither is what you're doing, Danny. You're keeping people safe. The students who walk these halls during the day, the professors who teach here, the visitors who attend events, they're all alive because janitors like us follow the rules. Dawn was approaching. the sky lightening to purple and gray. My shift was nearly over. I had survived another night. Tomorrow night, I'd come back and do it again. And the night after that? For how long? Weeks? Months? Years? I thought about Catherine Hendricks, or the thing that wore her face. I thought about Leonard Ashby and the broken beaker. I thought about all the echoes and impressions and parasites that haunted these buildings. I couldn't save them. I couldn't free them. But I could survive them. I could maintain the boundaries. I could follow the rules. And maybe, somehow, that was enough. Thank you to Theo. For the warning, for the rules, for tonight. He nodded and turned to leave, then paused. Danny? The hardest part isn't the fear or the horror. It's accepting that some things can't be fixed. Some tragedies can't be undone. The best we can do is prevent new ones. He walked away into the pre-dawn darkness, and I wondered if I'd see him again or if tonight had been his final lesson. I sat in my car and watched the sun rise over Crestfall University. The Gothic buildings looked beautiful in the golden light, innocent and scholarly. Students would arrive soon, filling these halls with life and noise and normalcy. They'd never know what prowled these corridors after dark. They'd never hear the whispers or see the shadows. And that was good. That was right. I was a janitor at a haunted university in Maine. I worked the night shift. I followed the rules. And I would keep following them for as long as I could, because someone had to. The price of survival wasn't just staying alive. It was accepting that survival was sometimes all you could achieve. No grand victories, no heroic rescues, just making it through each night intact and ready to face the next one. I started my car and drove home as Crestfall University awoke to another ordinary day. Behind me, in the basement of the South Building, in the restricted section of the library, in the chemistry lab and the clock tower, and all the other vessels scattered across campus, the dead settled back into their patterns, waiting, always waiting. But not for me. Not anymore. I knew the rules, and I would follow them. That was my job. That was my purpose. That was how I would survive.